The ancient ruins of Ephesus stretched before me in the pre-dawn darkness, silent witnesses to centuries of history and revelation. I hadn't planned to be in Turkey, hadn't even packed for international travel when I left my apartment in Los Angeles 3 days earlier. But the series of events that had led me to this place where the Apostle John once walked were so clearly orchestrated that I couldn't deny the divine hand guiding each step. It had begun with a recurring dream so vivid that I'd wake up gasping for breath, my heart pounding against my ribs like it might break through. In the dream, I was witnessing the rapture, that moment Christians have anticipated for generations when believers are caught up to meet Jesus in the air. But instead of seeing the beginning of this event as most rapture dreams portray, I was seeing its final moment. And what I saw in that final moment was so shocking, so contrary to everything I'd been taught about the rapture, that my mind would shut down and I'd jolt awake, unable to retain the details but left with a lingering sense of urgency and dread. After the 5th consecutive night of the same dream, I'd received a text message from a number I didn't recognize. The final moment will be revealed where John received revelation. The Library of Celsus, sunrise on the 3rd day. I might have dismissed it as an elaborate prank, except that moments after receiving the text, I'd turned on the TV to find a documentary about Ephesus playing, specifically highlighting the Library of Celsus and explaining that it was near Ephesus that John had received the revelation while exiled on the nearby island of Patmos. The confirmations had continued when I called to reschedule some meetings, only to discover that a production I was supposed to start had been unexpectedly delayed by exactly 1 week due to a funding issue. Then my neighbor, a Turkish-American professor I barely knew, stopped by to ask if I could water his plants while he was away, mentioning that he was flying to Istanbul that evening and had an extra ticket if I happened to be interested in joining him. Now, after 2 days of travel and a night in a small hotel near the archaeological site, I was making my way through the silent ruins of Ephesus by flashlight, guided by a special permit that the hotel owner had somehow arranged without my asking. The stars were still visible overhead, though the eastern sky was just beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The Library of Celsus, when I reached it, was even more impressive than it had appeared in photographs, its massive facade rising from the ancient stone street, its columns and statues creating dramatic shadows in the beam of my flashlight. Built in the 2nd century as a monumental tomb for Senator Celsus, it had once housed nearly 12,000 scrolls and had served as one of the most important centers of learning in the ancient world. Now it stood in partial ruin, its empty niches and weathered stones silent testimony to the transient nature of human achievement. But something about this place still felt alive with significance, as if the knowledge it had once contained had somehow seeped into the very stones themselves. I found a place to sit on a fallen column across from the library's facade and turned off my flashlight, allowing my eyes to adjust to the pre-dawn darkness. The silence was profound, not just the absence of sound, but a presence of stillness that seemed to press against my eardrums with physical weight. In this ancient place where heaven's revelation had once been received and preserved, I sensed I was about to receive a revelation of my own. "Lord," I whispered into the darkness, "I'm here as you directed. Show me what happens in the rapture's final moment, even if it destroys everything I thought I knew." For several long minutes, nothing happened. The stars continued to fade as the eastern sky grew imperceptibly lighter, and the ruins around me remained silent and still. Had I misunderstood? Was this entire journey based on nothing more than an unusual dream and a series of coincidences? Then, just as the first sliver of sun appeared on the horizon, casting long rays of golden light between the ancient columns, the atmosphere around me changed. The air itself seemed to become charged with electricity, creating a sensation like static on my skin. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath forming small clouds that hung suspended in the suddenly still air. And then he was there, not as a physical form that my eyes could see, but as a presence so tangible, so overwhelming, that seeing would have been redundant. I knew with absolute certainty that Jesus himself was with me among these ancient ruins, his presence filling the space between the weathered stones with a love so intense it was almost painful, and an authority so absolute it made me instinctively fall to my knees on the cold marble pavement. "Jonathan." His voice resonated not through my ears but directly in my spirit, carrying both infinite tenderness and sovereign power. "You have sought to know the truth about the final moment of the rapture, the moment that has been hidden from human understanding until now. What I am about to show you will destroy the comfortable assumptions many have built around this event and reveal why it is both more glorious and more devastating than anyone has imagined. I couldn't speak, could barely breathe under the weight of his presence. My journal lay forgotten on the fallen column as I knelt on the ancient pavement, every sense overwhelmed by the encounter. "Are you willing to see this truth?" he continued, "even though it will forever change how you understand not just the rapture but the very nature of salvation and judgment?" Finding my voice at last, I whispered, "Yes, Lord, show me, even if it destroys everything I thought I knew." "Then look," he said, and suddenly the ruins of Ephesus dissolved around me. I was no longer kneeling on ancient marble. I was suspended in what seemed to be the atmosphere itself, watching events unfold below me with supernatural clarity. The vision began with what I immediately recognized as the rapture in progress. I saw believers around the world being caught up from their daily activities, some from beds, some from workplaces, some from cars and planes and ships. Their physical bodies were being transformed as they rose, becoming luminous and perfect as they ascended toward a brightness above that was too glorious to look at directly. But then the vision shifted to show me something I had never considered before: the perspective of Jesus himself during this event. I was being allowed, somehow, to perceive the rapture through his eyes, to feel what he felt as he gathered his people to himself. And what I sensed was a complex mixture of emotions that I had never associated with the rapture before. There was joy, yes, profound joy at welcoming his beloved ones home. But there was also something else, something that felt like divine sorrow mingled with perfect justice. It was an emotion I had no human category for: a holy grief that existed without contradiction alongside perfect righteousness. The first truth about the rapture's final moment, Jesus explained as I experienced this from his perspective, is that it is not just a rescue of believers but also the beginning of judgment for the world. What you are feeling is my heart, as I simultaneously welcome those who have accepted my salvation and seal the fate of those who have rejected it. I had never thought of the rapture this way before, as a moment that simultaneously represented salvation for some and confirmed judgment for others. In our human discussions of the rapture, we had focused almost exclusively on the experience of believers being taken, rarely considering what this event meant from heaven's perspective or for those left behind. But the vision wasn't finished. It shifted again, and now I was seeing the actual final moment of the rapture, the moment that had been hidden from my dream memory, the moment that would destroy everything I thought I knew about this event. As the last believer was being caught up to meet Jesus in the air, I saw something that made my spirit cry out in shock and confusion. Jesus was weeping. The Lord of glory, even as he gathered the final member of his church to himself, was shedding tears that seemed to contain both joy and infinite sorrow. "This is the hidden truth about the rapture's final moment," Jesus said, his voice carrying that same complex emotion I had felt earlier. "As I take the last of my church to myself, I weep for those I must leave behind, not because I have not loved them, but because they have rejected my love." The final moment of rapture is simultaneously the final moment of opportunity for this age. But then the vision revealed something even more shocking. As Jesus gathered the last believer to himself, I saw him turn toward the earth one final time and speak words I could not hear but somehow understood. "It is finished." And in that moment, something changed in the spiritual atmosphere of the entire planet. I watched in horror as a tangible darkness began to settle over the earth, not physical darkness, but spiritual. It was as if a protective canopy that had been in place was suddenly withdrawn, allowing forces of evil that had been restrained to operate with new freedom and intensity. The second truth about the rapture's final moment, Jesus explained, is that it marks the removal of the restraining force that has limited the full expression of evil throughout human history. When my church is removed, my spirit's restraining work through them is also removed. What follows is not just the absence of believers, but the unleashing of darkness that has been held back for the sake of those being saved. I watched as this spiritual darkness began to manifest in the physical world. People who had been left behind, including many who had considered themselves religious but had never truly surrendered to Christ, began to experience a level of spiritual oppression, confusion, and deception that had never before been possible on such a global scale. But the most devastating part of the vision was yet to come. I watched as Jesus revealed the fate of millions who had considered themselves Christians but who were left behind. These were not people who had rejected the concept of faith altogether. These were regular church attendees, people who had prayed prayers of salvation, people who had participated in religious activities their entire lives, but who had never experienced genuine regeneration through surrender to Christ's lordship. Their reaction to being left behind was not what I expected. Instead of immediately recognizing their error and repenting, many of them became angry at God, bitter that their religious performances had not been enough to secure their rapture. Others quickly embraced explanations that denied the rapture had occurred at all: scientific theories, conspiracy ideas, alternative spiritual interpretations, anything that allowed them to avoid facing the devastating truth that their faith had been in religion rather than in Christ himself. The third truth about the rapture's final moment, Jesus said, his voice heavy with sorrow, is that it reveals the difference between religious performance and genuine regeneration. Many who call me Lord, Lord will discover in that moment that I never knew them, not because they didn't have correct doctrine or sufficient religious activities, but because they never surrendered their hearts to me in authentic relationship. I watched as these left-behind religious people gathered in their churches the Sunday after the rapture, listening to left-behind pastors offering explanations and reassurances that denied the reality of what had happened. The deception was immediate and nearly universal, not because these people were unintelligent, but because they had spent their lives building systems of belief that allowed them to feel spiritually secure without requiring genuine surrender to Christ's lordship. But Lord, I managed to say through my shock and confusion, surely some will recognize what has happened and turn to you even after the rapture. Some will, Jesus confirmed, and the vision shifted to show me people who had been left behind but who quickly recognized the truth of what had happened. Unlike the bitter or deceived religious people, these individuals fell to their knees in genuine repentance, acknowledging that they had known about Jesus without actually knowing him personally. But what you must understand about the rapture's final moment, Jesus continued, is that it marks a fundamental change in how salvation operates in the world. Watch what happens to those who do recognize the truth and repent after my church is removed. The vision showed me these repentant individuals facing a level of spiritual warfare, persecution, and testing that dwarfed anything believers had experienced in the church age. Without the corporate presence of the Holy Spirit through the church, their path to salvation required a level of endurance and faithfulness that few achieved. Many started sincerely but were eventually worn down by deception, hardship, or the overwhelming spiritual darkness that now operated without restraint. The fourth truth about the rapture's final moment, Jesus explained, is that it marks the end of the age of grace as it has been known throughout the church era. What follows is not the removal of opportunity for salvation, but a fundamental change in how that salvation must be worked out, not through simple faith alone, but through faith that endures unimaginable testing to the very end. The vision began to fade, and I found myself back among the ruins of Ephesus, still kneeling on the ancient pavement before the library of Celsus. The sun had now risen fully above the horizon, casting long shadows across the archaeological site and illuminating the facade of the library with golden morning light. But I sensed that what I had seen was only the beginning, that there were deeper, even more devastating truths about the rapture's final moment that Jesus wanted to reveal. The weeping of Christ, the removal of spiritual restraint, the exposure of false religion, the change in how salvation operates. These were only the surface realities of an event whose full implications were far more profound than I had ever imagined. Rest now, Jesus said, his presence beginning to withdraw, though not disappearing completely. Tomorrow, I will show you what happens in the moments immediately following the rapture, the reality that will truly destroy everything most believers think they know about this event. Meet me at the ancient church of St. John at sunrise. What I reveal there will change how you understand not just the rapture, but the very purpose of salvation itself. As his presence faded to a gentle awareness rather than an overwhelming encounter, I remained on my knees, trying to process what I had witnessed. The rapture, the event I had always seen as purely joyful and triumphant, carried within it a divine sorrow and a finality I had never considered. And apparently, what I had seen so far was only the beginning of its devastating implications. The morning sun continued to climb higher over the ancient ruins, tourists and guides beginning to arrive for the day's explorations, but I remained motionless, overwhelmed by the weight of revelation and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring even more devastating truths about what actually happens in the rapture's final moment, truths that would destroy everything I thought I knew about God's ultimate purpose in saving his people. The ruins of the ancient Basilica of St. John stood silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky, their weathered stones bearing silent witness to nearly 2,000 years of Christian history. Located on Ayasuluk Hill, overlooking the ancient city of Ephesus, This church had been built over what tradition held was the burial site of John the Apostle, the same John who had received the revelation on nearby Patmos, whose apocalyptic visions had shaped Christian understanding of the end times for centuries. I'd arrived while the stars were still visible overhead, climbing the winding path to the hilltop ruins by flashlight after another nearly sleepless night. The revelation I'd received at the Library of Celsus the previous morning had shattered many of my assumptions about the rapture, showing me Christ's weeping at the final moment. The removal of spiritual restraint from the earth, the exposure of false religion, and the fundamental change in how salvation would operate after the church was removed. But Jesus had promised to show me something even more devastating today: what happens in the moments immediately following the rapture, a reality that would destroy everything most believers think they know about this event. The weight of anticipation made each step feel heavy as I made my way through the ancient basilica ruins toward what had once been the altar area. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn as I reached the central section of the ruined church. Unlike the relatively well-preserved Library of Celsus, the Basilica of St. John existed mostly as foundations and partial walls, with only a few columns still standing to suggest its former grandeur. In the center of what had once been the main sanctuary, a simple stone marker indicated the traditional site of John's tomb. I sat down on a fallen column near this marker, watching as the darkness gradually retreated and the ancient stones around me began to take shape in the growing light. There was something profoundly appropriate about receiving revelation about the rapture's aftermath in this place where the man who had written Revelation had been laid to rest, where generations of believers had come seeking connection to the apostolic witness about the end of all things. "Lord," I whispered into the dawn stillness, "I'm here as you directed. Show me what happens in the moments after the rapture, even if it destroys everything I've believed about your purpose in this event." As the first rays of sunlight broke over the distant hills, illuminating the ancient ruins with golden light, I felt his presence returning the same overwhelming sense of holy love and authority that had enveloped me at the Library of Celsus, but somehow even more intense, more solemn, as if the weight of what he was about to reveal exceeded everything that had come before. "Jonathan," his voice resonated within my spirit, "yesterday I showed you the final moment of the rapture, from my perspective, my divine sorrow, even in the midst of welcoming my people home. The removal of spiritual restraint from the earth, and the change in how salvation operates after my church is removed. Today I will show you what happens in the moments immediately following the purpose and consequences of the rapture that few have understood because they have focused only on escape rather than on my ultimate plan." The sun continued its ascent, its light growing stronger with each passing moment, but I barely noticed as the world around me once again began to dissolve into vision. The ruined basilica, the stone marker of John's tomb, the entire archaeological site faded away, and I found myself witnessing something that transcended physical perception. I was seeing the moments immediately following the rapture, but from a perspective I had never considered before, the perspective of the raptured believers themselves as they first arrived in Christ's presence. And what I saw shocked me to my core. The believers who had been caught up were not immediately entering a state of eternal rest or celebration as I had always imagined. Instead, they were being gathered before what I recognized as the judgment seat of Christ, a place of evaluation and accountability that Scripture mentions, but that most believers rarely consider in connection with the rapture itself. "The first truth about what follows the rapture," Jesus explained as I watched this scene unfold, "is that my people are not immediately ushered into eternal rest, but into immediate accountability. The judgment seat of Christ is not a future event separated from the rapture by years or centuries. It begins in the very moment my people arrive in my presence. I watched as believers who had just experienced the exhilaration of being caught up and transformed now faced a comprehensive evaluation of their lives. Every thought, word, action, and motive was being revealed and assessed not for salvation, which was secure, but for reward and position in the kingdom that was to come. Some faced this evaluation with joy and confidence, watching as their life's work was tested by divine fire and emerged purified, refined, and validated. Others experienced what could only be described as a devastating realization of opportunity, wasted and potential unfulfilled, as much of what they had built with their lives was consumed in the testing fire, leaving little of eternal value behind. "Many of my people," Jesus explained with infinite compassion but unflinching truth, "have been taught to focus on the rapture as an escape from earth rather than as entrance into accountability. They have prepared to leave the world, but have not prepared to face my evaluation of how they lived while in it. The judgment seat is not about punishment, their salvation remains secure, but it is about honest assessment of what they did with what they were given. I watched as some believers who had been prominent and celebrated in the church discovered that much of what they had built was burned away as wood, hay, and stubble religious activity, performed for human recognition, rather than from genuine love and obedience. Others who had been overlooked or considered insignificant in the earthly church watched in wonder as their simple acts of faithfulness, performed without recognition or reward, were revealed as gold, silver, and precious stones of immense eternal value. But this is just the beginning, Jesus continued, and the vision shifted to show me something even more unexpected. After passing through this evaluation, the raptured believers were not entering a passive state of eternal leisure as I had always imagined. Instead, they were being organized, instructed, and prepared for active participation in what was about to unfold on earth. The second truth about what follows the rapture, Jesus explained, is that my people are not removed from concern with earth's affairs, but are being prepared for direct involvement in earth's final chapter. The tribulation period is not something my church observes from a detached distance, it is something they participate in from a new position and perspective. I watched in amazement as the raptured believers, now evaluated and assigned positions based on their faithfulness during earthly life, were being organized into what could only be described as a heavenly government in waiting. They were receiving instruction about their roles in the coming kingdom, being equipped with understanding about how heaven's authority would soon be established on earth, and being prepared to serve as administrators of Christ's rule when he returned to establish his millennial kingdom. But what shocked me most was seeing that these raptured believers were not passive observers of the tribulation events unfolding on earth. From their heavenly position, they were actively involved in intercession that directly affected earth's events, in preparation of places that would serve as refuges for tribulation believers, and in strategic planning for the establishment of Christ's kingdom once the tribulation concluded. My people have been taught that the rapture removes them from all concern with earth, Jesus said, when in reality it elevates them to a position of greater responsibility and involvement with earth's final redemption. They are not escaping the world's final chapter, they are being repositioned to participate in it from a heavenly perspective. The vision shifted again, and now I was seeing something that made my spirit tremble with holy fear. The raptured believers, having been evaluated and assigned positions in the coming kingdom, were now being shown the full reality of what was happening on earth during the tribulation, not as distant observers, but as intercessors who understood the spiritual significance behind physical events. The third truth about what follows the rapture, Jesus explained, is that my people are given full understanding of how the tribulation events are working together to accomplish my ultimate purposes. What appears as random chaos and suffering from earth's perspective is revealed from heaven's perspective as the precise unfolding of divine justice and mercy working together toward final redemption. I watched as raptured believers were shown how specific tribulation judgments were directly answering prayers they had prayed while on earth, prayers for justice for the oppressed, prayers for the end of human trafficking, his prayers for the destruction of systems that had enslaved and exploited the vulnerable. What looked like devastating judgment from earth's perspective was revealed from heaven's perspective as the direct answer to the church's centuries-long cry of, "How long, O Lord?" But even more shocking was seeing how these raptured believers responded to witnessing the tribulation from heaven's perspective. Instead of the detached relief I might have expected, the "thank God we escaped" that attitude I had always associated with the raptured church. They were engaged in constant, fervent intercession for those still on earth. They were not celebrating their escape, but were laboring spiritually for the salvation of those facing earth's final testing. My people have been taught that the rapture ends their connection with earth's suffering, Jesus said, when in reality it gives them greater understanding of that suffering and greater ability to intercede effectively for those experiencing it. The prayers of my glorified church during the tribulation are among the most powerful forces influencing earth's final events. The vision expanded further, and I began to see the ultimate purpose behind the rapture that had been hidden from most believers' understanding. The rapture was not primarily about rescuing the church from tribulation, it was about positioning the church for its role in establishing Christ's kingdom on earth. The fourth truth about what follows the rapture, Jesus said, his voice carrying both authority and urgency, is that my people are not being permanently removed from earth, but are being temporarily relocated to heaven for evaluation, preparation, and strategic positioning before returning with me to establish my kingdom on earth. The rapture is not an evacuation, it is a strategic redeployment. I watched as the vision fast-forwarded to show the raptured believers returning to earth with Christ at the end of the tribulation period, but they were not returning as passive observers or even as mere witnesses to Christ's victory. They were returning as prepared administrators of his kingdom, each one assigned specific responsibilities based on their faithfulness during earthly life and their participation in heaven's activities during the tribulation. Some were assigned governance over cities and regions, others were given oversight of restoration projects to heal Earth's tribulation wounds. Still others were tasked with educational initiatives to teach the millennial population about the events they had lived through and the God who had brought history to its culmination. Every believer had a role, a purpose, a specific assignment in the establishment of Christ's 1,000-year reign on earth. The rapture, Jesus explained, is not the end of my people's involvement with earth. It is a necessary preparation for their enhanced involvement with earth. They are not escaping from the world, but are being equipped to help transform it under my direct rule. But then the vision showed me something that truly devastated my understanding of the rapture's purpose. I watched as raptured believers, now returned to earth with Christ, began working directly with tribulation survivors, including many who had been left behind at the rapture but who had come to genuine faith during the tribulation period. And, instead of the hierarchical relationship I might have expected, with raptured believers in positions of superiority over tribulation believers, I saw something very different. The raptured church and the tribulation saints were working together as equal partners in the administration of Christ's kingdom, each group bringing unique perspectives and experiences to their shared mission of establishing God's will on earth as it is in heaven. The tribulation saints, having endured earth's darkest hour while maintaining their faith, carried a testimony and authority that even the raptured believers honored and respected. The fifth and most devastating truth about what follows the rapture, Jesus said, is that my ultimate purpose is not to divide my people into first and second class, those who escaped tribulation and those who endured it, but to create one unified body with complementary experiences and testimonies. The rapture and the tribulation are not opposing paths but complementary processes, creating a complete bride with both heavenly and earthly perspectives. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the vision began to fade, and I found myself back among the ruins of the Basilica of St. John, sitting on the fallen column near the marker of the Apostles' tomb. The morning light now illuminated the entire archaeological site, revealing details of the ancient church that had been hidden in the pre-dawn darkness. But I felt like I was seeing everything through new eyes, not just the physical ruins around me, but the entire concept of the rapture and its purpose in God's plan. What I had witnessed destroyed the comfortable, self-focused understanding of the rapture that had dominated much of contemporary Christian teaching. The idea that it was primarily an escape mechanism to spare believers from suffering while the rest of humanity endured God's judgment. Instead, I had seen the rapture as a strategic repositioning and necessary preparation of the church for its role in Earth's final chapter and the establishment of Christ's millennial kingdom. The judgment seat that immediately followed, the active participation in heaven's response to tribulation events, the preparation for administrative roles in the coming kingdom, and, ultimately, the partnership with tribulation saints in establishing Christ's rule on earth. All of this revealed a purpose far more complex and meaningful than mere escape. Why has this understanding been so rare in the church? I asked, still trying to process the implications of what I had seen. Because comfort is easier to preach than purpose, Jesus replied, his voice gentle but firm. It is easier to motivate people with the promise of escape than with the reality of responsibility. Many have presented the rapture as the end of my people's story when it is actually the beginning of their most important chapter. As his presence began to withdraw, though not completely, I sensed there was still more to be revealed, a final, even more devastating truth about the rapture's ultimate purpose that he would show me before my time in Ephesus was complete. Meet me at the temple of Artemis at sunset, Jesus instructed. There, among the ruins of what was once the center of pagan worship in Ephesus, I will show you the final and most shocking truth about the rapture, the reality that will destroy not just how believers understand this event, but how they understand the very nature of salvation and eternity themselves. The ruins of the Temple of Artemis lay scattered across the marshy field like the forgotten toys of giants. Massive marble columns toppled and broken, elaborate carvings half buried in mud, the remnants of what had once been one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, now reduced to a few standing pillars and a collection of stone fragments. Located about a mile from the main Ephesus archaeological site, this temple had once been the center of pagan worship in the region, a massive structure dedicated to the fertility goddess that had dominated the religious and economic life of ancient Ephesus. It was here, according to the Book of Acts, that a silversmith named Demetrius had incited a riot against the Apostle Paul, fearing that the spread of Christianity would undermine the profitable trade in Artemis idols. And it was here, in this place where paganism and Christianity had once directly confronted each other, that Jesus had instructed me to come for the final and most devastating revelation about the rapture's ultimate purpose. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon as I picked my way through the marshy field, navigating between broken columns and partially submerged stone blocks. Unlike the well-maintained archaeological sites of the Library of Celsus and the Basilica of St. John, the Temple of Artemis existed in a state of profound ruin and neglect, a fitting metaphor, perhaps, for the fallen systems of belief it had once represented. I found a relatively dry spot on a fallen column near the single complete pillar that still stood as testament to the temple's former grandeur, and sat down, watching as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the marshy field. After 2 days of revelations that had systematically dismantled my understanding of the rapture, showing me Christ's weeping at the final moment, the immediate accountability that followed, and the Church's strategic repositioning for active participation in Earth's final chapter, I could hardly imagine what further truth could be more devastating than what I had already received. Yet Jesus had promised to show me something here that would destroy not just how believers understand the rapture, but how they understand the very nature of salvation and eternity themselves. The weight of anticipation made the air feel heavy as I waited for his presence to return. "Lord," I said quietly, as the sun touched the tops of the distant hills, "I'm here as you directed. Show me the final truth about the rapture's ultimate purpose, even if it destroys everything I've believed about salvation and eternity." As the sun began to sink below the horizon, casting its last direct rays across the temple ruins, I felt his presence returning the same overwhelming sense of holy love and authority that had accompanied the previous revelations, but somehow even more intense, more solemn, as if the weight of what he was about to show me exceeded everything that had come before. "Jonathan," his voice resonated within my spirit, "what I have shown you so far has revealed the rapture's immediate aftermath and the Church's role during the tribulation and millennial kingdom. Now I will show you the ultimate purpose behind all of these events, the final destination toward which history is moving, that will transform how you understand not just the rapture, but the entire narrative of salvation from beginning to end." The sun disappeared completely below the horizon, leaving only its afterglow to illuminate the temple ruins, and once again the world around me dissolved into vision. The marshy field, the broken columns, the physical reality of the Temple of Artemis faded away, and I found myself witnessing something that transcended time and space itself. I was seeing beyond the millennial kingdom, beyond the final judgment, into what Scripture calls the new heaven and new earth. But what I saw was nothing like the disembodied, ethereal existence that many Christians imagine when they think of eternity. Instead, I was witnessing a reality so physical, so tangible, so earth-centered that it shattered my entire concept of salvation's ultimate goal. "The first devastating truth about the rapture's ultimate purpose," Jesus explained as I watched this scene unfold, "is that it is not about removing my people from earth permanently, but about preparing them for earth's ultimate redemption. The final destination of salvation is not heaven instead of earth, it is heaven coming to earth, transforming it into the dwelling place of God with humanity." I watched in awe as the New Jerusalem descended from heaven to earth, not as a metaphor or spiritual concept, but as a literal physical reality. The redeemed earth was being transformed into the eternal dwelling place of God with his people, not by the removal of humanity to a distant heaven, but by the coming of heaven to a renewed earth. "My people have been taught to think of salvation as escape from earth to heaven," Jesus continued, "when my ultimate purpose has always been to bring heaven to earth, to restore what was lost in Eden, and fulfill the prayer I taught my disciples. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." The vision expanded, and I began to see the activities of the redeemed in this new earth. They were not floating on clouds or engaged in an eternal church service as popular imagery often suggests. They were actively governing, creating, building, exploring, and developing a redeemed creation, fulfilling the original mandate given to humanity in Genesis to be fruitful, multiply, and exercise dominion as God's representatives. The second devastating truth, Jesus said, is that the rapture is not about rescuing my people from creation, but about preparing them to rule creation. Salvation's goal has never been to escape the physical universe, but to redeem it, to restore humanity to its original purpose, as my image bearers exercising dominion over a creation that has been liberated from bondage to decay. I watched as the redeemed, including both those who had been raptured and those who had come to faith during the tribulation, engaged in activities that could only be described as the perfect fulfillment of human potential. They were developing culture, creating art, exploring the vastness of the redeemed cosmos, building communities, and continuing to grow in their understanding of God's infinite nature. This was not a static, unchanging eternity, but a dynamic, ever-expanding experience of discovery and development. My people have been taught to think of eternity as the end of history, Jesus explained, when it is actually the beginning of history without the limitations of sin and death, the start of humanity's true development as they explore the infinite creativity and love of their Creator within a redeemed physical universe. But then the vision showed me something that truly devastated my understanding of salvation's purpose. I watched as the redeemed, now dwelling in resurrected bodies on a renewed earth, began to engage with the fullness of creation in ways that suggested that earth, even the new earth, was just the beginning of their eternal adventure. The third and most devastating truth about salvation's ultimate purpose, Jesus said, is that the redemption of earth is just the first step in the redemption of the entire cosmos. My people have limited their understanding of salvation to the rescue of human souls, when my purpose has always been the restoration of all things, the entire created order from the smallest particle to the largest galaxy. I watched in wonder as the redeemed, having fully established God's kingdom on the renewed earth, began to extend that kingdom throughout the cosmos, bringing the order, beauty, and glory of God's direct presence to worlds and realms beyond earth itself. The vision suggested an eternal adventure of cosmic scope, with the redeemed serving as agents of God's creative and redemptive purposes throughout a universe freed from the effects of the fall. The rapture, Jesus explained, is not just about the rescue of believers from tribulation or even their preparation for millennial rule. It is about the beginning of humanity's restoration to its ultimate purpose as my partners in cosmic redemption. What starts with the transformation of individual believers culminates in the transformation of the entire created order through their participation in my redemptive work. The vision shifted again, and now I was seeing something that completely transformed my understanding of the relationship between time and eternity. Instead of eternity being a timeless state completely disconnected from history, I saw that the new heaven and new earth represented the perfection and fulfillment of history, not its abolition. The story that began in Genesis was not being abandoned for something completely different, but was reaching its intended culmination. The fourth devastating truth, Jesus said, is that salvation is not about escaping the story I began in creation, but about participating in its perfect fulfillment. Eternity is not the cancellation of history, but its redemption, the completion of what I started when I said, "Let there be light," and declared it good. I watched as the redeemed continued to develop culture, create beauty, explore the vastness of creation, and grow in their understanding of God's infinite nature, all while in perfect communion with Him and each other. This was not the end of human development, but its true beginning, freed from the limitations of sin, death, and decay that had hindered humanity's potential since the fall. But the most shocking aspect of the vision was yet to come. As I continued to watch this eternal scene unfold, I began to see that the distinction between the raptured church and tribulation believers, which had seemed so significant from our temporal perspective, had completely disappeared in eternity. Both groups were fully integrated into one redeemed humanity, their different paths to salvation now seen as complementary aspects of God's comprehensive redemptive work rather than creating any kind of eternal hierarchy or division. The fifth and most devastating truth about the rapture's ultimate purpose, Jesus said, his voice filled with both authority and compassion, is that the distinctions that seem so important to my people now, who was raptured and who endured tribulation, who belonged to which denomination or tradition, who had the most correct theology, all fade into insignificance in light of eternity's reality. What remains is not how you came to me, but that you came, not which path you walked, but that you reached the destination. I watched as believers who had once divided themselves based on rapture timing, eschatological positions, denominational distinctives, and theological systems now served together in perfect unity, each one's unique journey and perspective contributing to the rich tapestry of the redeemed community rather than dividing it. The rapture, the tribulation, the millennial kingdom, all were revealed to be not competing theories to argue about, but complementary aspects of God's comprehensive plan of cosmic redemption. My people have created divisions based on their limited understanding of my purposes, Jesus explained, when from eternity's perspective, all who come to me by faith, whether before the rapture, during the tribulation, or during the millennial kingdom, are equally and fully part of my redeemed humanity, each with their unique testimony to my grace and their unique contribution to my eternal purposes. As the vision began to fade and the ruins of the Temple of Artemis gradually reappeared around me, now illuminated only by starlight and the faint afterglow of sunset, I felt the weight of this final revelation pressing down on me like a physical burden. The rapture, the event I had always understood as primarily about the rescue of believers from earth, was revealed to be just one component of God's comprehensive plan to restore humanity to its original purpose as His image bearers, exercising dominion over a redeemed creation. Why has this understanding been so rare in the church? I asked, my voice barely audible as I struggled to process the implications of what I had seen. Because my people have reduced salvation to the rescue of souls from earth rather than the restoration of earth itself, Jesus replied. They have made the story about escaping creation rather than redeeming it. They have focused on leaving the world rather than transforming it. And in doing so, they have missed the grandeur and scope of what I have been doing since the beginning, not abandoning my creation but redeeming it, not rescuing people from earth but restoring them to their purpose as my representatives within a renewed creation. The stars were fully visible now, countless points of light in the vast darkness above the temple ruins, and in their ancient, steady glow, I sensed a reminder of the cosmic scope of God's redemptive purposes, a plan that encompassed not just human souls but the entire created order, from the smallest particle to the largest galaxy. What should I do with these revelations? I asked, knowing that what Jesus had shown me about the rapture's ultimate purpose would challenge many of the most fundamental assumptions within contemporary Christianity. Share what you have seen, he replied, not to create controversy but to expand vision, not to condemn limited understanding but to invite my people into the grandeur of my cosmic purposes. Many who hear these truths will be uncomfortable, even angry, because they threaten the small, self-focused salvation narrative they have embraced. But others will recognize the ring of truth and will begin to understand that my purposes are far more glorious, far more comprehensive, and far more earth-centered than they have imagined. As his presence began to withdraw, though not completely, I sensed that the revelations about the rapture were complete, that I had been shown its final moment, its immediate aftermath, and now its ultimate purpose within God's comprehensive plan of cosmic redemption. Remember, Jesus said as his voice grew fainter, the rapture is not the goal of salvation, it is a necessary step in humanity's restoration to its original purpose. Share what you have seen so that my people might lift their eyes beyond their own rescue to embrace their role in the redemption of all things. As his presence faded to a gentle awareness rather than an overwhelming encounter, I remained on the fallen column, gazing up at the star-filled sky above the ruins of what had once been a center of pagan worship. The rapture, the event I had always understood as primarily about the escape of believers from a doomed earth, was revealed to be just one component of God's comprehensive plan to restore humanity to its original purpose and redeem the entire created order. The ultimate purpose of salvation was not to rescue people from earth, but to restore earth itself, to fulfill the prayer Jesus taught his disciples, "Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." The new heaven and new earth represented not the abandonment of creation, but its perfect fulfillment, the completion of the story God began in Genesis when he declared all that he had made very good. As I made my way back through the marshy field toward the road where my taxi waited, carrying the weight of these revelations, I understood why Jesus had brought me to the Temple of Artemis, this place where paganism and Christianity had once directly confronted each other. Here, Among the ruins of a fallen religious system, I had been shown the true scope of God's redemptive purposes, not the escape of disembodied souls to a distant heaven, but the restoration of embodied image-bearers to a renewed earth that would become the eternal dwelling place of God with humanity. The rapture's final moment, when fully understood, would destroy not just our limited conceptions of this prophetic event, but our entire understanding of salvation's ultimate goal. And in that destruction lay a far more glorious vision than most believers had ever imagined, a vision of cosmic redemption that began with individual salvation but culminated in the restoration of all things. This was the rapture's ultimate purpose, and the truth that would destroy everything most Christians thought they knew about salvation and eternity themselves.